Welcome to Viewpoint for the City of Farmington Hills. I'm Bill Costick, City Manager, and today I have as a special guest co-host our Mayor Pro-Tem, John Grant. John, welcome to Viewpoint.
Thanks, Bill.
We also have as a special guest today on our show our Finance Director, Chuck Rosch. Chuck, we're glad to have you with us.
Thank you.
Today we're going to focus on a subject that's of interest to everybody, especially the property taxpayers, and that is the city budget. We're involved right now in the whole month-long process of reviewing the city budget with the City Council. And this is quite a lengthy process. It really begins the first of the year every year. And throughout January and February, each department puts together its financial statements, its analysis of its needs for the next year. And they are submitted to me where I use the month of March and into early part of April reviewing their budget requests and preparing a consolidated budget that is eventually submitted to the City Council. And now we're into the month of May, and it's the City Council's responsibility to review with all of the department heads their various budget requests, the budget program, the capital projects, and by mid-June adopt a budget for our city governments and all of its operations. So in that process, we have a lot of work to do. You'll find the City Council, if you study the City Council agenda schedule, has a lot of meetings and spends a good deal of time looking into the various budgets. By way of example, this is a copy of the budget document. We don't normally go for sheer thickness of documents, but there are a lot of categories when you consider that we're responsible from subjects from police and fire, public safety, to streets, water, sewer, garbage, and just in a sundry of responsibilities that your city government does have. John, I know that this is a time of year that's very busy for you as a city councilman, as Mayor Pro Tem, and that you do look at expenditure areas very closely.
Yes. The city's grown a lot in the last 10 years. We just got our census figures from the 1990 census, and our population is now close to 75,000, which is up about 17,000 from the 1980 census. And I was talking to Chuck before we came on the air. When he first started with the township 20 years ago, 20 years ago, the first budget that he put together was in the neighborhood of $2 to $3 million. And now, as I look at the summary of our budget funds, our total funds that pass through the city are $46.5 million, which of course includes a lot of our road funds and our capital improvements and all of our debt service. But just the general portion, the general fund budget of our portion is now at almost $29 million. And 32% of that represents police protection. Then I think the next largest category, fire protection is 7% of the total budget. Refuse removal is 8% of the total budget, and library at 6%. Public services at 6%. The offsetting revenues to these, where our revenue sources come from, Chuck, can you give us a little bit of background on where we bring in the revenues?
Sure. Probably is no surprise to you. A major share of our revenue comes from taxes. 55% of our revenues, or approximately almost $16 million, are operating taxes to support police, fire, refuse collection. The next largest category is our state shared revenue. As you're aware, the state collects sales tax, income tax, and special business tax, single business tax. They remit some of this money based on population to each local unit, and that's about 17% of our revenue, or approximately $4.8 million. The remainder is made up of sales and fees that we charge developers, builders, contractors. As you're aware, we've had a slight downturn in the construction industry. So our building permit revenue is projected to be down about 16%, or about $161,000 this year. Our use of reserves has dropped somewhat because in the prior year we transferred a lot of our special census money that we had from the 1978 special census. We've transferred those to complete capital improvements. Our interest income is 5% of the budget. That's, we raise that by utilizing money until we are about to spend it and pay vendors and meet payrolls, we invest it. And that accounts for about $1.4 million a year, or about 5% of the general fund revenues.
Of course, a lot of the monies that we receive, for which we gain interest earnings, are in the form of special assessments that are required to be paid off, and then the or the payments for principal and interest, which are dispersed at some additional time into the fiscal or the calendar year, does afford us the opportunity to invest some of these funds, hopefully wisely. It's interesting to me to note that as we put this budget together this year, John, it was very difficult because probably more than ever before, with the downturn in the economy and the fact that the city is filling up, there were some considerable fluctuations in our various revenue categories that we had to deal with. Even though we've continued to grow and state shared revenues should be up because of our new census count, building permit activity and the resultant revenues, not only from building permits, but engineering fees, site plan review fees, zoning request fees, and the sundry of fees for which we make charges, those categories are all down drastically. One of the building permit categories had fallen 24%. And to give you an example, 3 years ago we received in revenue $1.6 million plus from all the building permits, and this year we're going to budget a total of $450,000. So there's quite a swing in our revenues that we've had to make up. We've been lucky because of the growth, and we've been able to keep things on a fairly steady keel, and that's been our objective as far as the revenue picture is concerned.
But at the same time, Bill, even though we realize a lot of benefit out of this growth, the growth also puts a big demand on the city for operations and additional services that have to be provided to people, and DPW, a bigger strain on the roads and the infrastructure, and all of those things have to be considered as well. Isn't that correct?
Oh, that's absolutely correct. Things have moderated slightly now, but if you would look at the record over the past 4 years for police and fire activity, the average increase was per year, from year to year, in terms of the number of incidents for which we were asked to respond, increased over 12% a year. So when you take that figure and realize the growth in the community with the police service requests increasing 12% a year, the number of fire department runs, mostly medical, but still personnel is required for that. And of course we have tried to keep up by expanding our group of employees that are able to respond when requested by the citizenry. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we, as we approach this budget year, just like many of you in your homes have had to do, the City Council instructed us early on that we should tighten the belt and let's hold the line. I think that we'll talk about this a little later in the show, but this idea of holding the line, perhaps no growth at all, came even before we were faced with all that's going on in Lansing with respect to property tax cuts, much of which we don't even know about today as to how it's going to impact us a year from now and what we really got to plan for in terms of operating a city government. But for example, the current budget, I'm happy to report to you that through attrition, it forecasts the reduction of 4 employee positions in the general fund, mostly in the Public Services Department and the Planning and Community Development Department, where activity is down in the area of new construction. So we reduced 4 positions. There's 1 additional position that's proposed to be added in the street division. So the net result of our changes is that our workforce in the general fund of 317 full-time employees will be reduced for the upcoming year to 314 full-time employees. So there's a reduction of 3 full-time employees from the prior year. So we are looking at...
I might also point out that the 1 additional person we did hire is not supported by property tax dollars, but by highway taxes, because his time and equipment is charged to the road funds, for which the general fund gets reimbursed.
I think an interesting thing for taxpayers to consider when they're thinking about their property taxes, particularly their city taxes, is that what is the percentage of their total property tax bill that the city receives? And it's somewhere in the vicinity of 17% of their
Correct.
property tax.
Out of each dollar, the city receives approximately 17% or 17 cents on a dollar.
So if
Goes
you-
for city activities.
If you consider a house valued at $120,000 with a $60,000 investment, then the property owner is paying to the city of Farmington Hills $540,
Correct.
about
Approximately
$540 a year in property taxes, which is about $45 a month, for which they get fire protection and police protection and library services and parks and rec and trash removal and all of the other services that the city provides. I think when you think of it in that terms, it really illustrates what a tremendous job the city does in providing services for the tax dollar.
Well, it is a challenge from year to year to balance our budgets, and it's a big process. We see cost increases in certain areas that outpace what many believe reasonable cost increases ought to be. For example, I recall a decade ago with the fluctuation in gas prices and the amount of gas that we consume as a city government operation, given that we have police cars on the road 24 hours a day. We have fire trucks that use a good deal of gas when they're called upon to respond to incidents, and our road maintenance equipment alone, especially with the number of miles of gravel roads we have, it really consumes gasoline. But parts for trucks and the purchase of new trucks, increased costs for labor and fringe benefits for our fine group of employees, these things, the supplies that we use, just like in the private sector, we have to pay for these, even though we don't pay sales tax on most of them. Asphalt-based products and construction materials, as you know, have risen dramatically over the past decade, and these are things that our Public Works Department is totally dependent upon, for example, and we're continually buying those kinds of materials. And so to operate the city government, it is very costly. One of the areas I know that you, John, have had as a special interest since you've been so involved with the library. John Grant used to be a member of the Library Board of Trustees before getting elected to the City Council and becoming Mayor Pro-Tem, is the cost-sharing formulas that are employed for, I guess, the library, and you're interested in the court, and the other jointly funded agencies.
All the jointly funded agencies. I felt particularly this year as we headed into a tightening of our belts in our budget and possibly looking at certain city services and the level of service that we provide to our taxpayers and the taxes that we have to collect from our taxpayers, that we had a responsibility to look at the jointly funded programs by Farmington taxpayers and City of Farmington Hills taxpayers, and just kind of reconfirm that we have an equitable distribution of those services as they relate to the taxes that are contributed to them by the residents of both cities. And we are going to be, I understand that we do have some documentation on that Chuck has prepared that council will be reviewing as we go into our budget meetings.
Well, I think maybe we could ask Chuck Rosch if he would share just briefly what the formulas are for the two major expense areas, which is the library and the district court, which together is well over $3 million in operating costs, right?
Correct. There are two separate formulas for each board. The library, going back in history to the late 50s, has been shared on the basis of state equalized value, with each city paying a ratio to the budget equivalent to their ratio of their city's SEV to the total SEV. This was an agreement entered into with the township, between the township and the city back in the 50s, and was the basis of founding the district library. Back then they levied, I think, 3/10 of a mil for library operations. As you're aware, if we did in fact have a separate millage to support the library, it would be raised based on state equalized value. So this is a logical way of sharing costs between the two cities. Plus it also tracks ability to pay because we each have a different tax base.
And the district court?
Now the courts were established by the Judicature Act back in the late 60s, and they provide that if you have no other agreement, you will share cost controlling units, of which the City of Farmington and City of Farmington Hills are controlling units for a shared district court, that they would share these costs based on caseload or any other agreement that they entered into. So since the establishment of the district court, we have shared on a formula that's weighted equally based on population and caseload between the two cities.
Okay, well, this year's budget for the city's general operations, which we call the general fund budget, we've been, as I've earlier indicated, very cautious about keeping our expenditures under control. In fact, as I explained, we issued a hold-the-line approach when department heads submitted their budgets. And I'm pleased to say that the overall general fund budget increase this year is 3.08%. So basically a 3% increase in expenditures from last year's budget request. Now, the state tax laws are very complicated, and we're going to take a break in a minute. But before we do, I just want to indicate that as far as taxes are concerned, we have rolled back our millage rate in the city government each of the past 2 years entirely, so there's been no roll-up. So in other words, if your property tax value on your home were to increase 10%, we've rolled back, if all averages were pure, that 10% in our millage rate. Now, what we're faced with at this time is, in order to balance this very tight budget, because of other revenue fluctuations, the recommendation that I've made to the City Council is that we roll back up, after we roll back whatever the general increase was across the board on the city average, in your assessments, the average growth in assessments, whatever that percentage was, and it was about 4.5%. We've rolled that amount back, and I'm recommending to the City Council to balance the city budget that we roll that back up 1.8%. So what you should experience is approximately a 1.8% increase. And how that relates, I know that John Grant was interested as to just what does that mean to the average taxpayer. And if you have a home that's valued, the average would be in the range of $120,000 of market value on the tax roll for $60,000 at the city's tax rate. That would mean that the increase at 1.8% would be between $8 and $9 for the whole year for all your city government operations.
Seems reasonable.
Well, that's the issue that the council, that's one of the issues that the council is grappling with at this present time. And certainly we've tried to keep the lid on things, and what we're really saying is with 3% growth in expenditures, that in order to meet that, we're going to need to have some increase in the revenue that's derived from within our community, given the fact that we are in a slower period of time.
Right.
So we'll be back in just 1 minute after this short, brief announcement.
Some people just can't get along without their gadgets. And then there are those who really can't. When you give to the United Foundation, one of the 154 agencies you help support is the Detroit Institute for Children. So give generously to the Torch Drive for all the good you can do.
Welcome back to Viewpoint. This is the second segment of our show today, and we're talking about the city's budget that's upcoming and that we're in the process of preparing. And with me is John Grant, our Mayor Pro-Tem, and Charles Rosch, our city's finance director. I'm Bill Costick, city manager, and as we left for this the brief break, we were talking about revenues and property taxes, a subject that I know all of you are very interested in, and certainly we are sensitive to what's taking place in the minds of all of us as we are property taxpayers wherever we live in Michigan. In addition to the normal types of activities and what we've described in the last few minutes as a hold-the-line budget, one of the new, and probably the only new program that is included in the budget is to institute July 1, 1991, and many of you will be happy to hear this. We've talked about it on this show before, but we're really going to do it, is to institute our curbside refuse collection program for recyclable materials. There'll actually be 3 collections. be the normal refuse collection. We're going to ask you to then separate your recyclables in a separate plastic bin that you'll be receiving. And then a third collection will be for compostables, leaves, grass clippings, pieces of twigs, trees, and so forth, bushes and shrubs and so forth, that can be ground up and have compost made out of them. This is an exciting program. Many people have expressed an interest in it. I know, John, you and other members of the council have been supportive of it. I think people are eager for this to start.
Oh, I think so too, Bill. I'm certainly real excited about it, and I know the whole council is very excited about the program starting. As I go out through the community, I hear nothing but very, very eager residents, really prepared to have the curbside recycling start and to really make a commitment to recycling. I think it's a tremendous program that we've got put together, and I think the community's ready for it. We're ready for it to start.
Well, the only downside to the whole thing, if there is a downside, is that somebody's got to pay the bill. Contrary to what some people think is it's going to save us money, the real hedge with the recycling is in the long term it will save us money because we won't have to have such big landfills or whatever other means we dispose of our refuse in the end process is. But in the short term, in the next decade and beyond, as far as we can see, it is going to cost money to recycle. And the way we've proposed to structure this is that we're going to institute a quarterly billing process, and through our 8-member Recycling and Refuse Disposal Authority that we are a member of, we propose to bill, what is it, Chuck, $13.50 per quarter?
Correct, $54 a year.
$54 a year, and you'll start to get a utility bill that will resemble a water and sewer bill.
Now that billing is just reflective of the cost of recycling, of the cost of the curbside recycling program, right? It does not have reflect any of our current costs of refuse removal, which are all included in our regular tax rates.
Right. That's a good point that you make, John. What you're saying is that we haven't reduced our budget that we normally spent for refuse collection and disposal by instituting this fee, and that is correct.
Right.
This fee is for all new services. The new services will include the curbside collection program of recyclable materials, the curbside collection program of compostables, the at least once a year conducting of a household hazardous waste collection program, and also we are going to institute July 1, if we get it in place, collection at all of our condominiums in the city, where we haven't collected from condominium sites in the past. We'll begin to assume that responsibility. So the $13.50 per charge per quarter, or $54 a year, will be for implementing this program. On another matter, I know, John, that you had some concern about our police department budget and its ability to continue to function. Just to give you some in-depth perspective, the City Council does go into a good deal of the line item expenditures for our major departments, and the police department is one of our major operating departments.
Absolutely. We meet with all of the major department heads and go over their budgets for each department. And although I've just seen the budget proposal for the first time this weekend, and we've got council, as you know, because you schedule them, has a number of meetings planned to meet on the budget. I did notice that of the total increase in our budget this year, the total dollar increase, that about 75% of that seems to be going as an increase to the police department budget. I know that we're not adding any new employees in that department, and that we have of course we have a 4% salary and wage increase in the department, plus their fringe benefits, and have had some substantial increases, I understand, in work comp and Blue Cross and that type of thing. But one of my concerns as I look at this and the rate that it's increasing without adding any employees is that we're still going to be able to meet the needs of the community for police protection.
Well, this year it's the first year in the last 10 years that I've been here that we haven't added any police officers. And it is true that we've had to just hold the line, and I think in part, I think it's a wise move and prudent at this time because, as Chuck Rosch would clearly tell us both, given all the activity in Lansing over property tax reform and just the issue of tax reform in general, and some of the legislation that proposes to reimburse communities and others of the legislation proposes no reimbursement, we really don't know where we're going to end up a year from now. So I think it's critical that we are conservative and be prudent, but I think the police department, as an operating department of the city, will continue to move forward and be able to implement its innovative techniques as it's done in the past to meet the needs of our growing community.
I think that's true, Bill. I think they've been very prudent in the use of their resources, and that's borne out by some of the statistics. Our incidents are down, our crime rate has dropped for the year. It's the biggest drop in in the 17-year history of the city. Our traffic accidents are down. I think this is due to the prudent use of resources. We have a crime prevention bureau that has been successful in dropping burglary rates. We have volunteer handicap enforcement. We've been able to take advantage of grants, which has provided us a auto theft unit, and we've also got a drug unit. So I think that even though the manpower is static, proper use of it has allowed us to make an impact on the street.
Well, one of the other areas of major focus is always directed to capital improvements. And I would say that as we approach this next year, there are many capital improvements that we've talked about for some time, John, that are most exciting. Flipping through the various pages of this lengthy budget document, we're going to do an extreme amount of drain work again this year, as you can see. And I'd ask if you jump in on any of these that your pet projects. I know that you've been very supportive of our drain improvement program that would stop some of the flooding in the community.
Yes.
And our 12-mile road boulevard.
The 12-mile road boulevard is looking real nice, by the way. They're doing the plantings up there, and the boulevard is looking very nice.
Well, it's coming together, and while we won't see any more major construction activity in the summer of 1991, we are budgeting for the next mile, which will be between Halsted and Haggerty Road, and that will be under contract and hopefully under construction by this time next year. But that will be a budget consideration at this time. Another item we have in the budget is the expansion of our Public Works garage to begin to do some architectural analysis of what would be necessary from the very cramped DPW facility that we are attempting to operate out of. Also the purchase of land at our fire station for another fire station someplace in the central part of our city.
As I look at this, out of a proposed capital improvement recommendation of $3.1 million, we've got $1.730 million just going in drainage alone.
Well, it's an area that we've been very, very, very active in and will continue to be as we look to the future of the community. And then there's the usual construction of, or the purchase of equipment, fire trucks, DPW vehicles. So all in all, the budget of the cities is very complicated. I know that you were concerned about the economic uncertainty that lies ahead for the city governments throughout the state, not only Farmington Hills. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, I think as we look to the future, we've got to recognize when we're looking at our budgets that we are in a time filled with some economic uncertainties as to what our traditional tax structures will be. There is a lot going on in Lansing in the legislature with tax proposals, tax cut proposals, tax freezes, changes in the traditional types of revenue sharing that we've experienced. And I think, as you've indicated before, and as comes through in this budget, which is very much hold the line budget, it's a time for us to kind of put the brakes on and make sure that we've done everything that we can possibly do to be in control of the situation should we get any surprises in reductions of revenue in the year or two ahead of us.
Well, that's very well put, John. And in a brief half-hour Viewpoint show, we could hardly give a just service to the complications of putting a budget together for the city the size of Farmington Hills. We've not only grown in population, but in stature, in terms of numbers at least. I would report to the citizens that in terms of population of cities in the state, We now rank the 13th largest city in Michigan, moving from the 17th spot with the last census. So we do have problems. I think that one of our goals is to maintain the kind of character in Farmington Hills that you've been accustomed to in the past. And that'll be our challenge as we approach this budget year. And I want to thank you, Chuck, Rosch,
Thank you.
City Finance Director, for being with us for this show. John Grant, our Mayor Pro Tem, it's been a pleasure to have conducted this show with you.
Thank you, Bill.
And to you viewers, Viewpoint is shown every Thursday at 7:30. We encourage you to continue to watch. Have a good day.